Well, let's get started. Any newcomers here? Well, then, oh, hi. You should have a hearing aid buying guidebook just to sort of get you caught up with some of the things we've been talking about. I'm Ron Levitt, 32 years ago. David here and I started this group to provide a community forum for people to hear from those who use hearing aids, not those who are dedicated to sales of hearing aids. My background is in auditory research, and I am an audiologist at Corvallis Hearing Center. My Director of Operations at our clinic, the Corvallis Hearing Center, is Nikki Clark. She's a lifelong hearing aid wearer who's presented at international conferences for many years now, I think 8 years now, and is a lifelong hearing aid user herself. David is former Executive Director of the Southwest Washington Service Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing People, recipient of the President's Award for Outstanding Service to People with Hearing Loss, and past president of the Hearing Loss Association of America Portland chapter on several different occasions. And he is going to, he's currently a cochlear implant wearer, but had been a hearing aid wearer for over 30 years. And I'm going to be introducing some other people as we go along here, because I think there will be, in fact, there's a little section here I've saved for consumer comments. We are recording this today, and I intend to send portions of it to some of the players in this slideshow so that they can hear from some other people who have hearing loss. But with that, let's get on with it. We're going to talk about the value of good hearing aid programming. A lot of people don't know this, but hearing aids, when you get them from the manufacturer, are a blank slate. They have nothing, no instructions on them as to how to correct your hearing loss. So it's up to the person who is fitting the hearing aids to do the proper programming. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to choose this topic. And here's the way we're going to lay out this presentation. First, we're going to talk about why we're talking about this particular topic. Next, we'll be talking about, oh yeah, I got to do that, don't I? The current laws that support this new change in hearing health care. The third thing we're going to be talking about is the evidence that supports this as a good idea. The fourth thing is the evidence in opposition to this idea. The fifth and sixth, will Medicare pay for any of this that we're talking about? And finally, a little look into the future of hearing health care based on what has just happened within the last few months that's really changed the entire health care scene as far as hearing loss and balance disorders go. Starting with the main person who began this push. It's Dr. Frank Lin from Johns Hopkins Medical University. He's an otolaryngologist, and he's also a public health specialist. And over the years, since 2012, really, he came on the scene, he started making some recommendations regarding hearing health care.
Hearing is a remarkable thing. It underlies almost everything we do every single day, our ability to engage with others, our ability to engage with the world around us. And yet, hearing loss, the loss of our ability to perceive and understand sounds, is incredibly common. We see that about 1 in 12 Americans has a significant hearing impairment, and this grows from about 1 in 1,000 kids being born with a significant hearing impairment to ultimately, as we age, that nearly two-thirds of all adults over 70 in the United States have a meaningful impairment that interferes with their daily lives. We're increasingly in research, we're seeing that hearing impairment, it increases our risk of developing dementia, it increases our risk of developing cognitive decline and loss of thinking and memory abilities over time, and even increase our risk of progressing to disability over time. And a lot of that has to do with just how integral hearing is to the brain. We're understanding that if you can't hear well, there's constantly a load put on your brain because you're constantly having to spend more energy to process this very, very degraded sound. At the same time, we're understanding that hearing loss may actually have a direct effect in terms of the brain structure, in terms of stability of the brain, how fast the brain shrinks and atrophies over time. The big unknown question, which we're just beginning to focus on now here at Johns Hopkins, is addressing how much of a difference does hearing loss treatment make? Can it actually reduce the risk of cognitive decline? Can it reduce the risk of dementia over time? Those are studies that are ongoing right now. At Johns Hopkins now, for the last 25 years, we've had one of the most comprehensive clinics now for cochlear implantation. Cochlear implantations are remarkable. They are actually a prosthetic device that can restore the sense of sound for many people. And it used to be that cochlear implants were seen as just something for kids who were born deaf. But increasingly now, the vast majority of cochlear implants are actually done in older adults, people in their 60s and 70s who have naturally lost hearing over time. And importantly for these individuals, we're finding that just like children, cochlear implants can make the biggest difference in their lives sometimes by allowing them to re-engage with the world around them as opposed to just being in the corner saying, well, I can't hear, I'm fine, right? And increasing understanding is not fine anymore, that hearing impairment is something that we do need to take seriously as a society, as a government, and the world essentially in terms of its impact on what we consider to be healthy aging. So in Better Hearing and Speech Month, I urge all of you to take this broader perspective, understanding that hearing loss is just one small component in the grand scheme of health, but understanding that it comes with incredibly cascading consequences for our overall abilities and our daily lives. So I think if any of you have any concerns about your hearing, or in particular loved ones' concerns about hearing, clearly the first step is just assessing it, to get a hearing assessment, a hearing evaluation, to find out whether it's even the case or not. And this is pretty simply done. Hearing tests are almost always covered by insurance, and it's something that can be done quickly in a 15 to 30 minute appointment that can set the stage for understanding what is going on with hearing and basically how it's impacting your life.
So that all kind of makes sense. The Johns Hopkins studies have shown that hearing loss doubles to 5 times increase the risk of dementia. So he's saying that we're looking to see if perhaps treating hearing loss effectively can offset the shocking rise in the incidence of dementia in this culture. And that part made a lot of sense, and he got a lot of press for that, as you can tell. He was on national television a number of times sending this message about the factors that are associated with hearing loss, more increased likelihood of hospitalization and longer hospitalizations, doubled increased risk of falling, 2 to 5 times greater risk of dementia. So all these factors together all make sense. But there was a second part to his presentation, and here's 2 of them that we saw. And this is a slide he presented here. And this part was where he was talking about ways to improve accessibility and affordability of health care. And this started in 2014 was the first time we heard his presentation. And what he said essentially is summarized here in this slide. First of all, he showed that if you buy a personal sound amplifier online by computer, you can probably learn to use it in 3 hours for X dollars, let's say. And typically the price for those things was about $300 or 3 to 5, depending on which one you're looking at. But let's just use 300 as a number. He then proceeded to say, but if we could get community health volunteers to help with this, perhaps they could teach you in a day, or you could have learned yourself in 3 hours, which I don't really follow that logic. But it would cost more money because we may have to pay them something for gas mileage or something anyway, so it would be more expensive. Maybe we would double the price of that $300. By contrast, we could go to a hearing aid salesperson, a hearing aid dispenser, and then it would take you 1 to 2 months to learn how to use the amplification device of choice, and it would cost 3 times as much money, let's say $1,000. Alternatively, you could go to an audiologist. It would cost 4 times as much, and it would take you 3 months to a half a year to learn how to use the hearing aid at such a facility. Now, I have submitted a lot of papers to a lot of professional conferences in the last 42 years that I've been an audiologist, and when I submit data such as this, a slide, the reviewers ask the following questions. Number 1, okay, how many patients did you have in each of these groups? Were they the same patients? Were they matched in some way? Were they randomized to the groups, or were they just the same people every time? How did you select your subject population? What were their characteristics? What were their ages? What were their sexes? And what were their educational information, as well as were they experienced in technology? Those would be the sort of things they would ask if I submitted this slide for a presentation. They would also ask, how many different community health workers did you test this theory on? Because after all, you just said community health worker. How many, is this one community health worker, 100 community health workers? How many places did you try this and look at this? Same question about the hearing aid dispensers. How many hearing aid dispensers were in your subject population? Were they blinded to the purpose of the study? And how did you measure the average time? And what were the range of times it took to train them? And they would have asked that about the previous 2. Same with audiologists. How many doctors of audiology did you look at? How many different facilities? How representative were they of the typical population? Was there a statistical analysis showing the power of this research, which means how likely could you generalize this to the entire population of people who are audiologists or community health workers or hearing aid salespeople or individuals. But then I noticed, and this is my last edition here, and I just made this up because after all, the first 4 parts he made up because there were no subjects ever run. There were no statistical analysis. This is a slide that exists completely from something he made up. So I thought I would make up one too, one that he forgot. Apparently, he forgot that there are ear, nose, and throat doctors that sell hearing aids also. And if we're going to look at costs and time, and we're going to make something up, why not just make it 5 times as much expensive, I thought, and twice as long to learn it? Because after all, it's all just made up. Doesn't even match expert opinion.
Also, Dr. Franklin doesn't deal with hearing aids or hearing aid users himself, so there's no way for him to really do this whole study himself either.
So it started off really well. This presentation we heard first in Las Vegas and later at Portland at the National Center for Rehabilitative Auditory Research, funded by the Veterans Administration. They brought him out from Baltimore and paid him to generate this data. The first half of the presentation made perfectly good sense. This last part, I couldn't have gotten this published. People would not have invited me anywhere to present this slide without some description of the subjects and the numbers and the statistical analysis. I promise you, I couldn't get into any conference with this slide without some data. Then, at about 2015, the National Academies of Engineering, Science, and Medicine convened a panel. And you'll never guess who is at the front of the panel. Health care for adults, priorities for improving access and affordability. Well, this is what Franklin has been talking about for 2 years now. He was on that panel. He wasn't the one that led the panel, but certainly when you read it, it sure sounds a lot like his presentation. And this group, the National Academies of Engineering, Science, and Medicine, is the group who advises Medicare on what they're going to pay for. So, they put out a booklet with some highlights that I've outlined for you. First, many people don't have access to hearing health care and can't afford it. Well, couple of things about that. Medicare does pay for hearing evaluation, providing that the physician doesn't already know about the condition and is not related to the fitting of hearing aids. Diagnostic audiology, when referred by your general practitioner, is covered under Medicare currently, but I wouldn't hold my breath thinking it was going to stay that way, and I'll show you some reasons. In this publication, they ask for researchers to develop and promote measures to assess and improve quality of healthcare services. They also wanted to empower consumers and patients in their use of hearing health care. And they suggested that every federal agency that has money that does anything with people with hearing and balance problems kick in some money for projects and studies that look into self-administered hearing health care. In other words, take care of yourselves. And the models that are found to be most effective should be widely implemented at a national level. And son of a gun, you'll find out that's exactly what happened. And fund these studies they did. Here's 3 of them from the Johns Hopkins group, funded by the National Institutes of Health. You can see the first one funded at over $500,000, Franklin being the lead investigator. You can see another one here at just under $240,000, so we're almost up to $1 million already just in the first 2 studies. And what were we looking for? Models to improve self-care. And this guy here, Larry Humes, the department head of the Speech and Hearing Sciences Department at Indiana University, also got a piece of that action to the tune of $375,000 from the National Institutes of Health. And what were they looking for? They were looking for a service delivery model that was more efficient and cost-effective, involving self-assessment and self-treatment of hearing and balance problems. And, like I said, they got $375,711 for this project from the National Institutes of Health. And what did NIH want to find? Well, innovative models, including outcomes that are patient-centered and cost-effective. They even sent the clinical trials coordinator from the National Institutes on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders to guide this study. Now, I'm not sure why a team of PhDs whose job it is to do research, their training is in research, needs to have Dr. Gordon Blackstone Hughes show up to help them with this study. And I don't know why he was critical to the success of this study. But that's the foreword that Dr. Humes noted. So what happened next, you might ask? Well, first of all, the law was changed. On August 19th, 2017, President Trump signed into a law a bill that said you can buy hearing aids over the counter. Anybody that wants to get a shelf full of hearing aids, can sell them. By 2020, they hope to have all the details worked out, so you'll be able to go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and get yourself a hearing aid while you're at it. And the FDA joined in. Immediately in effect, guidance document, conditions for sale for air conduction hearing aids. FDA regulations have been identified as a potential barrier to availability and access of hearing aids. Effective immediately, FDA does not intend to enforce sale of hearing devices, period. They've lost interest in consumer protection for hearing and balance disorders, and they will no longer require any type of physician oversight or medical oversight. And then FDA granted what's known as de novo clearance for the Bose self-fitted hearing aid. What is de novo clearance, you ask? Well, when you have Class 1 or Class 2 devices under the FDA medical regulations, if you can show that you're doing something that hasn't been done before and doesn't seem that harmful, then you can get a clearance to go ahead and start doing it without any data of efficacy. Okay, well, good for Bose. One more thing I'd like to say about this. Bose isn't the first person, the first group, who has thought, you know, there are 35 million people with hearing loss in this country, and there are only about 2 million hearing aids. If we applied our marketing knowledge, we would be able to dramatically impact that population. Instead of 2 million, there should at least be 10 million. And why wouldn't they come to us? After all, we're 3M. We have a huge marketing budget. We have a huge marketing department. Why don't we get into the business of hearing aids and cochlear implants? Well, son of a gun, they did back in the 80s for about 4 years. Then AT&T got the idea, you know, we're making telephones and they're kind of the same. They have a microphone, they have an earphone, they have an amplifier, and we know how to do this. And all of our engineers work on pet projects, and one of them, named Vincent Pluvinage, has been working on a good hearing aid. Why don't we get into the hearing aid business? Because after all, 2 million hearing aids, 35 million hard of hearing people. What an untapped market. And with our knowledge of how to sell telephones, we should be able to really make a killing here. And then there was Philips Electronics, same thing, big electronics firm. We're going to get into the business of hearing aids, and we're going to make one that's right on your eardrum. And we know how to do this because we've got a great marketing department. Well, didn't go particularly well, so they sold it to Bausch & Lomb, thinking the same thing. Well, we know how to do eyeglasses and contact lenses. Why don't we get into the hearing aid business? Well, the punchline to this story is everyone except for Bose, who got into it just a few minutes ago, went out of business. And you think, well, that's inconvenient for people that already own their stuff, and now you can't get it fixed, you can't get it repaired, you can't get it reprogrammed because the software is obsolete and doesn't work with the new computers. But those people who got cochlear implants, those are the ones you really ought to worry about, because somebody drilled into their head and put a wire through their cochlea and destroyed their main residual hearing, and then 3M lost interest in it and disappeared. And funny thing about 3M, they got into the earplug business too with the military in a big way. They were really selling earplugs to soldiers to protect their hearing. And son of a gun, come to find out they faked their data, and now there's a major class action lawsuit against them again. So their life of hearing healthcare has not gone particularly well, either for consumers and now maybe even for them. And it couldn't have happened to a better group as far as I'm concerned. Yes?
So what happened to those people with the cochlear implant that 3M left?
When it runs out, that's that. They could have it dug out and have another one put in, but there's nothing to be done. 3M is out of the business. Don't you love it?
So any repairs on those cochlear implants?
Programming?
Programming. Sorry.
Yeah, it worked on Windows. It was before Vista.
97?
Probably on Windows 97, and no computer can make those things work now. So there you
Go in and have the whole thing taken back out?
Yeah.
You'd have to have surgery again and have a whole new cochlear implant processing unit put in there.
So let me say this about the big companies that are going to get into this business, because there's a huge untapped market. You all are not a typical market. You're not like telephone purchasers. You're not like sticky note purchasers. You're not like CD player purchasers. You're different. You have a condition that's a little more complex. Your needs are a little more complex than what is answered by a sticky note, a CD player, or a landline phone. So, how have these devices been doing with people with mild to moderate hearing loss? Because after all, that's what the law said. Adults 18 and older with mild to moderate hearing losses can buy these hearing aids over the counter and self-fit and self-treat. Well, like I said, there exists both supporting and opposing data. Here's the evidence in support. We already talked about Larry Hume's paper. But here's the punchline. The over-the-counter model of service delivery yielded only slightly poorer outcomes than the best science there is for fitting hearing aids. So you've got your doctors of audiology with their 10 years of training. You've got yourself, and you can do just as well as these doctors are doing. And Frank Lynn and his group at Johns Hopkins said that 3 of the personal sound amplifying products, PSAPs as they're known, demonstrated an improvement that was within 5 percentage points of a state-of-the-art hearing aid. The Oticon Nero is the one they were looking at. And the ones they particularly liked were the SoundHawk, the Etymotic Bean, and the Clear Sound CS50. I never thought anybody would wear a CS50. It's just too big and ugly. So I looked at a couple of the others, the Etymotic Bean and the SoundHawk. And here is the paper that we wrote evaluating select personal sound amplifiers, and by select I mean the ones that Frank Lynn and his colleagues said were the ones to get, and a consumer decision model, that's Larry Hume's work, for over-the-counter amplification. That was published in December of this last year. What we did was first we looked at these mild to moderately impaired subjects of Hume's, and he didn't really specify much about their hearing losses, but he gave me enough information that I could work backwards from the data he did give and figure out how many people really did have mild and moderate hearing losses in this group. And what I found was that if 30 subjects had a 45 decibel hearing loss, which would be moderate, then you couldn't get the numbers he got. If 25 subjects had 50 decibel hearing losses, still in the moderate range, you couldn't get the numbers he got. And if they had...
What was the total population?
153.
Thank you.
And if you had just 8 people with 55 decibel hearing losses, you can't get his numbers. So out of 153 people, he couldn't have had 8 people that really had hearing losses that were on the low end of the moderate range. He couldn't even have had 30 subjects of the 153 that were on the high end, the good end, the moderate range. And we also took a look at what Reed and colleagues, AKA Frank Lynn and the Baltimore group, looked at. And this was troublesome too. The authors reported that the unaided speech understanding scores on this speech and noise test at a very soft level of 35 loudness units ranged from 73 to 80% correct. Well, the funny thing about that is a moderate hearing loss begins at 41. So if you're presenting something at 35 and your hearing's at 41, it's 6 loudness units below your threshold. So it would be very hard for you to get 73 or 80% correct on your score.
Because you shouldn't be able to hear it.
No, you'd be 0%. You'd have to get 0%.
Being generous.
In short, both groups claimed to have subjects with moderate hearing loss, but neither did. So what happened when we actually used subjects with moderate hearing loss? Well, remember, a moderate hearing loss ranges from 41 to 55. This is from the American Speech Language Hearing Association website. And let's just talk about the blue lines. The blue lines show how much benefit there was from the various conditions. Let's start off with the best science we had. You can see that the benefit was pretty substantial. The errors were very few when people were allowed to have the best scientific hearing aid programming we know about. Secondly, by the consumer decision model recommended by Humes, we replicated it exactly with the same hearing aids. We just used people that actually had hearing loss. And come to find out, their benefit was almost non-existent. It was almost equivalent to the unaided results. Same thing with the etymotic bean, and recommended by Johns Hopkins, and the sound hawk recommended by Johns Hopkins. So, the benefit, as you can see, is greater than 400% with the best science you have, regardless of which of these systems you're looking at. And that was the nature of our publication. In short, there was virtually no benefit with the Humes consumer decision model or Lynn's preferred personal sound amplifying products. So, Humes wrote a letter to the editor about our article. What a shock. Hearing loss severity and over-the-counter hearing aids. Larry Humes comments on article by Levitt, Bentler, and Flexer. First of all, he said, one could argue with the way in which I've chosen to characterize the hearing loss. Well, yeah, I did argue with it. I proved mathematically they couldn't have had moderate hearing loss. There is no question that most of our study participants fall in the mild hearing loss category and many in the normal category. Okay, so you're confessing. That was sort of my point. The target group, though, is not required to meet any sort of a hearing testing definition, even though he was the one that used the words. I'm just using his own words, mild to moderate. But they're not required to meet a mild or a mild to moderate categorization. If an individual perceives that he or she is having hearing difficulties, an over-the-counter hearing aid can be pursued. So the gold standard, apparently, is not audiological evaluation and all that goes with that to identify medically treatable hearing problems and get to the true cause of the hearing loss. But the thing that is the gold standard is your perception of your hearing loss.
Ron, related to that, a thought occurred to me as I was reading this PowerPoint presentation. A person could have some type of auditory processing problems. They could have depression. They could have other types of mental health issues going on that might make them think and wanting to attribute it to a hearing loss as opposed to what might actually be the case. And none of that was tested out. So just this idea of a perception of a problem, it's like saying somebody's put a curse on me, and it's got the same scientific validity, in my opinion.
Or you could just have a plug of earwax in your ears, and that could be a perception of a hearing loss. We've seen several patients that go, yeah, they're in their 40s, my hearing's declining, it's just getting worse and worse. We look in the ear and it's 100% plugged up. We remove the earwax out of their ear and they're like, wow, you cured me. We do a hearing test and by golly, they're normal. If they would have gone to the store or gone somewhere and gotten a hearing aid and just crunched it over their earwax problem, it's just not going to do any good.
What I've noticed is that most people that start experiencing hearing loss, say in their 30s, all the way up into their 40s, they don't really realize it. Sometimes their wives or friends or someone are saying, hey, speak up a little bit of that, and they think it's normal. They don't really find out that they have a hearing loss in regards to what we're talking about here. They don't even realize it, not really, until it's at least moderate, if not getting up there.
I agree with you completely. What were you going to say? Go ahead.
The reason for that is it's so gradual. It slowly happens over time. It's not like you, and this can happen, but it's not most people with hearing loss, they don't just wake up with sudden hearing loss. It can happen. You can wake up with sudden hearing loss, but most people, it's a gradual over time, slowly decreasing.
32 years ago, when I started this group, I would say to people, hearing loss is very insidious. It just kind of sneaks up on you. But here's the funny part of that story. I have my assistants test me from time to time, and I had no idea how much hearing loss I had. Now, I've been an audiologist for 42 years. I've published probably 50 articles, 25 book chapters on hearing loss. I didn't know that I had as much hearing loss as I did. That's why every now and then I have my assistants test me, because I really didn't have any idea how bad it had gotten. Yes, Sylvia.
My question is, if I have a terrible stomach ache, is that a heart attack, or is that going to be a stomach ache? Do I have to perceive what the problem is and treat myself like with an acid or something? I mean, that's what you're saying here. It's perception.
Good analogy.
And medical problems are not valid.
Well, and we've identified the fact, listening to Frank Lynn talk, that hearing loss is not just something to be ignored. It has consequences. More incidents of falls, doubled or 200% more likely to fall down, 500% more likelihood of dementia depending on the degree of hearing loss, longer hospitalizations, more frequent hospitalizations. It's not without implication. Yet, here they are saying it's, who cares what the hearing test results show? Curious thing for a department head at Indiana University in the speech and hearing department, training doctors of audiology to say. The Board of Regents should take a look at this letter and say, wait, we're funding this program for how much money?
Over perception?
He continues on.
I have a question over there.
Yes.
This doesn't even address the issue that you're probably going to address about the actual physical loss of brain tissue.
Yes. Yes.
There have been studies that show that.
Yes. What Kevin said is it doesn't address the brain shrinkage that Franklin mentioned in that first little video clip. Humes continues. Audiology and audiology best practices, meaning the best science we have for programming hearing aids, serve 20% with more severe difficulties well, including these 6 individuals that we use. But this is not the target audience, and somehow they're going to know they're not the ones to get this. Rather, it's the underserved 80%. So, in this room, if there's 10 hard of hearing people, only 2 of you really need good hearing aid programming. Wait, what are audiology best practices after all? Well, in other words, what's the science around hearing aid programming? Well, Nikki, first of all, if you go to the American Academy of Audiology website, they have convened panels of experts on every single topic related to what audiologists do. And you just click on the link and it opens it up and it shows you here's what gives the best outcome based on our extensive review of the literature. And here's the one for guidelines for the audiologic management of adult hearing impairment, guidelines for fitting hearing aids on adults, and diagnosing hearing problems. Michael Valente is the chair, good friend of mine from Washington University Medical School in St. Louis. These other folks, Harvey Abrams is well known in the profession. They are both in private practice, in hospital environments, in medical settings, in research settings. Todd Ricketts is the hearing aid expert at Vanderbilt, the #1 rated audiology program in the country. Sweet Ho is at University of California, San Francisco, retired now, but this group was convened to scour the literature for, I think he told me, 5 years, reading hundreds of articles on good outcomes for people with hearing loss. And they comb through the scientific literature to identify all the articles that address successful outcomes for people that are getting hearing aids. They rated each article according to a scientific criteria with opinions and ideas, expert opinions and ideas being the lowest form of scientific evidence, and giving much more credence to those clinical trials where they randomized subjects, blinded them to what the treatment was, and conducted statistical analysis to see the extent to which those results would be applicable to a larger population of people with hearing loss. In other words, they use a scientific method. And they looked at the following areas. The two we're going to really focus on are unaided speech understanding and aided speech understanding and real ear aided measures. To summarize, he talks about what constitutes a complete hearing test. He talks about the importance of getting unaided speech understanding scores in noise, because people sometimes say, you know, I take these hearing aids off in noise because I do better without them. Well, that's something you want to address the day they get those hearing aids to see if it's true or not, because if it is, they shouldn't be buying the hearing aids. Discussion of the person's listening demands. If you're 93 years old and you stay in your room all day and maybe one person comes in during the day or two and you do not have really that much listening demand and you just want to listen to TV, you probably shouldn't buy the most expensive hearing aid in the world. Real ear aided measures, which Nikki's going to describe, and aided speech testing and noise. Those are the components of best science in treatment of hearing loss for adults. And we got $10,000 for putting this together into a single-page form that looks like this, and it had everything I just said on it. It shows all those areas and how to prove that you did better with the hearing aid than the person did without it, which is, to my mind, a critical thing that everybody should be doing. Like I said, it addresses the greatest hits.
But let's talk about real ear aided measures. A few of you probably have had real ear aided measures on your hearing aids. I can see a lot of people that I recognize that we've had in the room. We've done this with their hearing aids. How it works is this is the real ear machine. It's a machine that plays a sound, and there's a microphone that goes in the ear. I'll go through it. The probe tube goes inside the ear, which is a microphone. And then the hearing aid goes inside the ear, and the microphone picks up the sound that the hearing aid is hearing and prints out a graph like this. Okay, so this is what the screen looks like once we print out the real ear result. The red line is the individual's hearing loss, and the dashed line is the the target line where we want the target to be. The little squiggly line, the pink and the green that you see on this one, and that is what the hearing aid is doing for them. And you want them to meet that full correction dotted line. If it's not meeting that full correction dotted line, then you're not going to be hearing all the speech sounds that you need. Now, you may be asking, okay, it's hitting everywhere except for right in here. It's not increasing right there in the high frequencies because it's outside their range of hearing anyway. This person's hearing loss is in the 100 decibel range for the high frequency. So even if I were to amplify to this line, it's not going to provide the speech that they need because the speech sounds for those high frequencies are right up in here, so it's outside their range of hearing. By contrast, if you look over here on the left ear for this individual, that's their left ear hearing loss, and the dashed line is meeting the hearing aid target is exactly is at a full correction, and that's what you want to see with your hearing aid fitting. If you're not getting this done, you may be having a hearing, it's called a manufacturer's fit, and it's where the hearing aid dispenser or the audiologist goes to the computer, puts your hearing loss in there, and tells the hearing aid manufacturer software to just go. Then you put the hearing aid on the individual and say, how does that sound? Well, it may sound a little bit better than what you're used to, but you won't really know all the sounds that you're hearing because you can't know what you're not hearing. This graph really shows you exactly what you're still missing and what you're able to hear with the hearing aid on. So make sure wherever you go that they do real ear programming. And you'll know it's happening because that microphone that goes inside your ear tickles a little bit, okay?
I think Nikki's being facetious. We did a study of 179 hearing aids from 24 facilities in Oregon, and we found that less than 5% of them bore even the vaguest resemblance to the individual's hearing loss when you looked at the real ear measures. So the chances of that happening are pretty low.
Mm-hmm.
Let's remember that the person that doesn't hear, when they're not hearing like what you're talking about here during some test and they don't hear it, they don't know they're not hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
That has a profound effect upon the consequences of where it's going to wind up.
Yeah.
I think that you have to be careful because a lot of places will say they use real ear measurements, but what they're using is what the company sends them to use. Mm-hmm. And they will say, well, that's real ear measurements, but it's not. They're not using the machine that actually does it like you're talking about.
Yep, there's no microphone down in the ear hearing what the hearing aid's amplifying. And yes, that is true. There are some hearing aid manufacturers that have something in there called measurement or real ear gain or something to that effect. And they just press that button, tell it to go, and they say, oh, yep, it's doing it. But it's only for that hearing aid manufacturer. So it will lie and say, oh, this is what it's doing. Kind of like there's a hearing aid manufacturer that says, oh, we can amplify up to 12,000 hertz, which is in the really high frequencies. And when I've turned that up or turned it down, whatever, on the real ear machine, the real one, it doesn't show that it's actually doing anything. It doesn't show any gain whatsoever has been added there. By contrast, on the computer, on the manufacturer's real ear version, is saying, oh yeah, you're improving their hearing. They can hear in the 12,000 range. And they're not.
Both the Vanderbilt group and the Washington University Medical School group showed that the manufacturer software is always grossly in error. And some hearing aid manufacturers, you'll be turning up 2,000 hertz, which is in the higher frequencies, and it's actually bumping up 1,000 hertz, and I see that on the real ear machine. So it doesn't match up. Even what I'm trying to turn up, the individual frequencies on the computer, is not really doing it. So I have to go to a different band and turn that up because
I know, real ears showing me.
And our real ear system has to meet rigorous calibration requirements every year. We pay a lot to have it done. Manufacturer software has no requirements. They don't have to be calibrated. They can say it's 1,000, it could be 3,000. It doesn't matter. There's no oversight procedure to see that the manufacturer software is doing anything that it says it is.
The other thing that's done is speech testing and noise. We want to see what the hearing aid is doing for you in noisy situations. And there is a test called the Quick Speech and Noise Test, which we utilize. And the background noise gets louder and louder. And with each sentence, a woman comes on and says a sentence, and you're supposed to repeat the sentence to the best of your ability. And we want to see at which point you can no longer repeat that sentence. In this study, why this one is the best one is the QuickSyn is more sensitive, has a more sensitive measure of recognition performance in background noise than other tests like BKB-Syn and the hint material. Making sure that everything's catching up here. It's also the best predictor of hearing aid success in your daily living. The hint in terms of setup requirements, ease of administration, scoring, low cost, and similarity between normative and sample values. There's also been numerous studies to see which test, the hint, QuickSyn, BKB-Syn, was the best. There was 188 people that did this test, and they graded it to see which one was more realistic to your daily living experience. And the QuickSyn is the winner there. Anything you want to add there on that?
Yeah, those 188 people were doctors of audiology, researchers, and people who are graduate students in various programs. So they all got together and they rated them according to this Anderson grading scale, which is a grading scale that shows how good a test is. And the clear winner when you go through all these is the Quick Speech and Noise Test, which is why we use it and why Anu Sharma, who did the study, uses it at UC Boulder. And it is also, according to surveys, the most frequently used study in our profession. But my opinion is it's not used very much.
Not used enough.
At all.
So what it's like is, you can hear it.
Pitch the straw through the door of the stable.
Pitch the straw through the door of the stable.
The sink is the thing in which we pile dishes.
The sink is the thing in which we pile dishes.
Post no bills on this office wall.
Post no bills on this office wall. You hear how the background noise is getting louder and louder?
Dimes showered down from all sides.
Dimes showered down from all sides.
Pick a card and slip it under the pack.
Pick a card and flip it under the pack. I know one of them's peg.
I have no idea.
One of the words.
See, that's the beauty of this test. Even normal hearing people can't get 100%, so it has no ceiling. So it is a very good way to separate out the wheat from the chaff, as it were, to see what's really working for a person and what's not. Or, if you've done everything to make it work, what limitations they're still going to have. So, clearly Humes and I have a difference of professional opinion on these data. And this is David's part to summarize Humes.
Yes, we said mild to moderate hearing loss, but our subjects actually were normal hearing or mildly impaired. But that doesn't matter. It's the person's perception of hearing loss or lack thereof that matters, according to the study.
Can I say a word about that? Let's look at the other side of this. We've been talking about people that don't really have hearing loss, that might think they do because of various things like earwax. What about that 18-year-old who is teased all through elementary, junior high, middle school, high school because of her big hearing aids, and finally she's 18 now? What does she decide? I don't really need these, and I sure don't need the grief that comes with wearing them. Now that I'm going to college, I'm going to quit wearing these things, because after all, the gold standard is patient's perception of need.
And the science of hearing aid programming doesn't matter except to 20% of the population of people with hearing loss. And to summarize our position, if you are going to call your subjects mild to moderately impaired and change the national laws and the FDA requirements, some of your subjects should actually have a moderate hearing loss.
Because some of the subjects that he had had normal hearing, and they were doing this study with the over-the-counter products with normal hearing.
Disregarding audiology best science and relying on patient perception of hearing loss as a gold standard can be a slippery slope. Maybe Hume should spend more time with the 80% of the population who he claims does not need best audiology science.
I think we will right now. Kevin, you're in this category. Why don't you come up here and say a few words about your perception of this situation? There's a mic over there for you and a chair. Dr. Marshall is a rehabilitation counselor, was department head at Western Oregon University, and is himself a hearing aid user. So I would be interested in your thoughts on the subject.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
About specifically what, though? Well, about the whole issue? Mm-hmm. Seems to me that their population, they're treating a lot of non-hearing impaired people as if they had hearing loss, which is interesting to me. But as a rehabilitationist, you've got people self-diagnosing, mm-hmm. and that's a very inaccurate way for things to be diagnosed. You can't do a rehabilitation program unless you have an accurate diagnosis to begin with. And they're basically leaving out the whole diagnostic section of the normal route of hearing aid determination and fitting. That's a big loss, because you're starting out at the wrong place. You can't put together. You go to a medical doctor, he doesn't just start treating you. He diagnoses what you have first, and then he treats what he finds from the diagnostic procedures. If you omit that, where do you start? That's like she was saying, if you have a stomach ache, you just start taking antacids and see if it works, but you might be having a heart attack or an ulcer or who knows what else.
Now, you're clearly in that category of the 80% that doesn't need the real ear measures or the diagnostics. Personally, how does that sound to you? But I do need. I do need it. Not according to Hume's. Not according to Hume's. You're clearly in that 80%. Your hearing loss puts you right smack dab in the middle of the group he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I believe you tried some of these personal sound amplifiers when we were doing the study. Wasn't he one of the? No, he wasn't.
No, I wasn't part of that study. But again, that's like, if I think I have a hearing loss, I go in and crank up the volume on my stereo. That doesn't address the specifics of what my loss is or what it's caused from.
Or just tell people to start yelling at you.
Yeah, like my wife, she lets me know. But I think, if you don't address the specifics of the frequency loss and areas and all those kind of things, again, you're just guessing. You don't know what you got. And just increasing volume will certainly help all those people that have normal hearing that they had in their sample. I guess. Yeah. So, what question I have is, how are the hearing aid manufacturers responding to this sudden plethora of cheap so-called treatment modalities that are available. Are they lowering their prices to get back in the market a little bit?
I wish. Because, hearing aids, the more you want with your hearing aid like mine, it streams phone calls directly to my hearing aid. I have a microphone device that can clip onto someone and it'll stream their voice directly to the hearing aid. I can listen to audiobooks from my iPhone, having it streamed directly to my hearing aid without having to wear anything around my neck. So in order for that to work, these hearing aids cost $3,500 per ear. Hearing aids aren't cheap. Insurance can cover hearing aids, but it depends on what plan you have. And if you have Medicare, forget it. They don't cover the hearing aids.
Well, and Ron can address the variables that involve the price of hearing aids, such as what the veterans get in their special preferential discount.
Yeah, we had a friend who worked at the VA, and we found out the pricing of what they get the same hearing aid, that $3,500 hearing aid that we use. They got a 76% discount on the hearing aid compared to what we pay for those hearing aids, which is just crazy.
You can bet they're not losing money,
Right.
but they wouldn't do it if they weren't
They
making money.
fight to be in the VA system, so they couldn't be losing money.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question real quick, like related to what was just said. Why have not hearing aid manufacturers done studies, legitimate studies, that would address these particular issues that, like what Humes did, which just doesn't make sense? It's not good science. Why haven't they come out with their own studies? Or funded studies through reputable outfits like other universities, etc.
David, that's a great question. What do you think? Why?
I honestly don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, if their market is being diluted by all of these $300 items that you can get in the AARP magazine.
But that was going on before they came out with these PSAPs. This is not a new phenomenon.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you're big enough, you can get away with it. United Healthcare has been doing it for a decade.
Yeah.
And I think also these studies, they paid money for them to find out that this system works. They didn't want to pay money to find out that it doesn't work. They said, I will pay you $300,000 to figure out how this works, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't the other way around, so.
Sylvia, was there something you might say about all of this up here on the microphone, preferably? Kevin, maybe you can switch place with Sylvia. I told you you'd be impressed by this presentation.
Trust, next. If I didn't have hearing aids, I probably wouldn't have a husband.
Hold that microphone.
There you
If
go.
I didn't have hearing aids, I probably wouldn't have my husband still with me, because he goes bonkers when I take my hearing aid off because I can't hear him. So I want them tuned up as high as I can get them, so I can go out in public. If I didn't have hearing aids, I would not leave the house. And that's how bad it is. And not to have them tuned up with real ear measurements is just unreal. If it's a gold standard, why aren't they using it?
Well, you've had a progressive hearing loss over the last 15, 20 years you've been coming to the clinic. At what point would you have said, well, I really didn't need all of that in the beginning because I was in the mild category, and then I kind of moved to more closer to the moderate category, and then I am in the moderate category? At what point in that transition would you have said, I don't really need any of this best science applied to me?
I would never have said that. I just think that science is so important so that I can hear. Without the science, where are you? You're just kind of guessing. It's by guess, by gosh. And I don't really think that's effective. And this perception thing just drives me crazy, because if it applies to all types of health issues, that's unreal.
You could draw a parallel with glasses. This is the same as going to Payless or Rite Aid.
The dollar store.
Buy their dollar store and buy what you think will work for reading, instead of having bifocal kind of things that adjust for all your specific needs. Thus, per eye, everything is different left and right.
Well,
You're just, like a one-size-fits-all from Fred Meyer. That.
Yes, and Kevin is using an analogy I often hear about eyeglasses, but keep in mind, eyeglasses are for what would be called in the audiology profession conductive hearing or vision problems. By that I mean neurologically there's nothing wrong. It's that the lens or the eyeball shape itself is out of whack. The mechanics, the mechanical device is out of whack. Well, that happens in our profession too. I see people whose mechanical device is out of whack. The eardrum and the three little bones connected together, they're out of whack. They're frozen together. Well, send them up to OHSU or Frank Warren at Portland Clinic and have them take out the bones, put a strut through there, and change their hearing back to where it belongs. Those problems are curable now. But when you have retinal deterioration, that's a whole different ball game, and that's what all of you have. You have the neurological strata malfunctioning. You do not have a mechanical problem. And so the eyeglass thing that's solved by the wrong shape of eyeball or an irregularly shaped lens is rather perfunctory to solve. But try developing retinal problems and you'll discover that life's a whole lot more difficult. I'm one of them, My ophthalmologist gets me every 6 months and looks in my eye and does an ultrasound of my retina and said, you're showing some pre-signs of this retinal problem. And going and getting glasses from Best Buy or any place else that sells those little things on for magnification, that's not going to address my problem any more than these personal sound amplifiers are going to address your neural problem, because your hearing loss is complex in the sense that you've lost hearing for soft sounds, but your tolerance for loud sounds is what it was when you had normal hearing. So what I have to do is I have to make soft sounds a lot louder. I have to make loud sounds a lot softer simultaneously and really have it work instantaneously so it never hits your measured uncomfortable listening levels. That's not something you address with some stupid thing you bought online. Rush, you were going to say something. Thank you, Sylvia.
Sylvia,
Up here.
I applaud you about what you said there back in the beginning. I want to
Do it here, please.
Here. So kudos to Sylvia on the awareness and the self-discipline that you did way back there in the beginning. But so I want to compare that to how many times have you heard, say, somebody in their 30s that doesn't want to do hearing aids because of the way they look, the aesthetics of it. So what possibly could be the reason that a person would make that kind of sacrifice? Well, I say it's because they don't realize what kind of sacrifice they're really making. They don't know what they don't know, like you said, Nikki. They don't know what it sounds like for what they don't hear. So when they think about the aesthetics, it's not a same apples to apples sacrifice. They think,
I'm okay. I'm hearing okay, which is not the case at all. And I say that a lot of what's going on now in regards to the discussion that we're having here is the same phenomena. So many people that have hearing loss don't realize what they're sacrificing, so they're vulnerable to the marketing strategies. Let's put it that way. Thank you.
What also worries me is you as the consumer, you may have read something to the effect of, Hume's or one of the, maybe not the studies, but something that was in the paper, or other, saying that these personal sound amplifiers or these over-the-counter devices work just as well as state-of-the-art hearing aids, because that is what's being reported. So you, as the consumer, goes to Walmart, whatever, get this over-the-counter hearing aid, try it out, and you maybe hear something, better than nothing at all, but you go, I'm still not hearing well. And then you think, these are just the same as state-of-the-art hearing aids. Hearing aids aren't going to do me any good, so you just give up. That's my biggest fear, is that those consumers are going to say, okay, oh well.
Which is why the phenomenon of most hearing aids in the past, I don't know about today, up to date, but they used to be residing in the drawer next to the bed.
The thing I've noticed, and I've said this before, but I'll say it one more time. Most people do not search out hearing aids or hearing assistance until they have a very significant hearing loss. And denial is the most common thing that happens when you start to not be able to understand. It's other people, they mumble, and so on and so forth. When you've already admitted you've got a problem, you're at least, in my opinion, at the moderate level. So now you go out and you get a PSAP, and you don't realize that really that PSAP is not going to compare to what a hearing aid could do. So you're underfit, thank you. Underfit, you're doing yourself a disservice by turning around and settling for a PSAP and never looking into what a legitimate hearing aid, properly programmed, could actually do for you. That's my big problem with this whole situation. Actually, I've got a whole bunch of problems with it, but that's one major one.
The other thing is over-the-counter hearing aids or PSAP, they don't raise individual frequencies to your degree of hearing loss. It's taking everything and raising it up. Kind of like taking the TV and just turning up the volume. Everything gets raised up. It's not just the low frequencies and the high frequencies. But we can do that with hearing aids properly programmed. We can go in and say, oh, Kevin, you need a little bit more gain in 1,000, where maybe Russ needs a little bit more gain at 3,000. It's not one size fits all. And unfortunately, with these over-the-counter hearing aids, you may have some poor high-frequency hearing and good, normal-ish hearing loss in the low frequency. What's going to happen with that over-the-counter hearing aid is it's going to raise up those low frequencies and kind of distort things for you and make it difficult for you to hear in those really loud environments like a restaurant or something like that, because it's overpowering those low frequency sound where it's hardly doing anything for the high frequencies.
I'd like to point out one other thing. This 80% is, according to what I saw there, 80% of the folks have at least normal, what's considered normal. 20% of us have some kind of hearing loss. I say, from my personal experiences, that 80% has no concept of what we're experiencing by being hearing impaired. How many times have you run into the situation where say for example, my hearing aids aren't taking me up to the perfect level and I'm in someplace like a gas station and the guy comes up and he starts asking me questions and I say to him, I can't hear you, I'm hearing impaired. Would you kindly raise your voice a little bit? So he starts out up here and then next thing you know he's right there back down here. He doesn't relate because he doesn't understand. He can't. That has a big effect on us.
Let me tell you a little something about that 80%. Humes was talking about 80% of people with hearing loss don't need best science. At what point would you didn't always have a severe hearing loss, at what point would you, back in the earlier days when you had a mild hearing loss, then a moderate hearing loss, at what point would you have been willing to give up the science behind hearing aid programming?
Where would I have been willing to give it up? Nowhere. No way.
That's the thing.
Yeah, but it took me a little while to get it figured out. In truth, you remember, I started out way back there 25, better than 25 years ago. I started out with a miracle ear with a full shell thing and everything, and it about drove me crazy. I realized it's not, that's a butt, not a drive. But anyway, it really bothered. I had a very difficult time, and eventually I ran across this fellow that I'd heard about, Ron Levitt, and we learned about the real hearing device because he and I were discussing it, and Ron was really said, hey, you know, you're right on the money there, because I was saying, you know what they say, this hearing aid is supposed to be telling me to hear, and what I'm hearing are two different things. I wasn't hearing. In fact, it was annoying me.
And then you followed up and said, is there not some way that you can see what this thing is doing on my ear?
Right.
I thought that was brilliant. Yes, there is.
Yeah.
Let me go. There's one other little surprise I'd like to give you here, that there's other evidence in opposition. It's not just our article that was heavily criticized by Humes, but there was somebody else who just recently, last month, published a paper. Now, the study was published, as I said, last month, after the over-the-counter hearing aid law has been passed and FDA has lost interest in hearing-impaired consumer protection. Authored by Frank Lynn and his associates at Johns Hopkins, a pilot comparison of adjustment protocols of personal sound amplification products. In this pilot, we explore the ability of users to self-adjust personal sound amplification devices using only materials provided by the manufacturer. Outcomes to assess adjustments included speech and noise measures and real ear measures. And here's the punchline. We found that the best science model provided the best outcomes. But then this odd little statement afterwards. However, it's unknown if the difference is clinically meaningful. I'll summarize this one. We might disagree with our previous position in the law that we brought into existence and the removal of the FDA audiologist oversight, but maybe it doesn't matter. Again, I know.
That's
isn't
so
it
bizarre.
stupendous? I know. Isn't it? I saved the punchline for last. The people from Johns Hopkins think that maybe this doesn't work as well.
Maybe we screwed up, but oh well, maybe it doesn't matter.
He started out making
Very scientific.
agree with it now. And then he contradicted himself, and now he's contradicting his contradiction.
Well, I have to admire it. You know, Raymond Carhart, the founder of our profession, once was asked about a mistake he made, and he simply said, I don't think that anymore. I got better data. Well, maybe he'll change his mind, too. Will Medicare pay for any of this hearing aid business? Not a penny, and they never will. It's very hard to get a law unlawed.
What about all these other doctors on that list? Are they backing you up?
Yes, I don't want to incriminate them.
What was the question
but
again?
What about these other people who are on the committee to look at the best scientific procedures? Originally I wrote a letter back to Humes that one of my co-authors said, oh my God, you can't send that. But it really said what I wanted to say. And we sent a more watered down version that went like this. regardless of your intended audience for these devices, there are people who have greater hearing losses that are going to try to use these devices. And there will be people with moderate hearing losses. And we know they're not going to work for them. And there's going to be parents, indigent parents of poor children, who are going to say, oh my gosh, I can't afford $3,500 for this kid. Let's put a PSAP on her. After all, they're just as good. This guy said so. These two guys said so. So why would Medicare pay for any services in the future? Those of you who have hearing aid benefits, I predict 5 years they'll be gone. And FDA says that medical oversight is unnecessary and the over-the-counter law has already been passed. It's a done deal. And that is what your future will look like. And in 5 years, guess who else will be gone? Bose. What they're going to discover is that they're not using noise-canceling earphones on an airplane with some people who are pretty tech-savvy. They're going to discover that people are trying to use these that actually have serious hearing issues, and they are not that tech-savvy as a group. Trust me, I've looked at them for 42 years, tens of thousands of people with hearing loss. Bose will follow 3M, Philips Electronics, and AT&T back to the Neverland, and they shall never again look at hearing loss as those great markets that they can tap into. This is my prediction.
That'll match their logo, you know, where the guy's sitting in front of the loudspeaker and his hair is blown straight back.
They're contributing to the population with hearing loss.
Yes. Well, questions, comments?
Yes, I have one more. Considering the day and age that we're living in with all of the counterclaims, and we're totally inundated with all kinds of, what do we call it, information? Overwhelmed with information coming from all kinds of directions in this. So we are in a state of confusion, understandably so. So I want to remind us all to have a faith in, let's call it CS, common sense. Very uncommon. Think yourself. Do what you're doing here today, and then use your common sense.
Abraham Lincoln is often attributed with the saying, but I believe that researchers said he never really said it, that you can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Well, it's interesting to see that from Johns Hopkins. Like I said, I applaud them. Maybe they're changing their mind. And when they really start looking at this with people who significantly have hearing loss in the moderate category, this is not going to go well for them. I can promise you that.
Well, let me just say this regarding your comment there. I've heard it said that common sense is actually is not very common. So.
Good heavens. Oh, no.
Well, thank you all for coming. Next month, we're going to be talking about the effect of aging brain on speech understanding. There's a brand new study out that sheds some interesting light on what happens in the brain as we age that affects our ability to understand speech. So hope to see you all then, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. We still, on daylight savings, have a little time to enjoy it. Hope to see you the second Thursday of April at this meeting where we'll be in conference room B as in boy again.